In the first week of November 1942, on a moonless night in Iron Bottom Sound, 4 American torpedoes slid through the black water off Cape Esperance. They ran straight. They ran hot. They ran 10 feet below the surface, exactly as their designers had promised, and they passed cleanly under the hulls of 3 Japanese Daihatsu landing barges without touching wood or steel or flesh. The wakes vanished into the darkness beyond the last barge. On the bridge of the American patrol torpedo boat that had fired them, a young lieutenant watched his weapons disappear and understood, for the first time, that his war would not be won with the tools he had been given. 3 miles across Sealark Channel, on the Coral Apron at Henderson Field, 23 Bell P-39 Airacobra fighters lay in the mud. They had crashed on landing, or fallen from the sky under Japanese cannon fire, or simply died where they sat during the September bombing raids on the airstrip. Rain fell on their broken wings. Rain fell on their shattered canopies. Rain fell on the 37mm Oldsmobile M4 automatic cannons that were still bolted into every one of their noses, still perfectly serviceable, still waiting for someone to walk past them and see them differently. 500 miles north, aboard the battleship Yamato at anchor in Truk Lagoon, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto held a stack of loss reports in one hand and a fountain pen in the other. He was 58 years old. The kind of tired that does not come from missed sleep, but from watching a plan he had built over 10 years begin to collapse in front of him. 4 destroyers of the 8th Fleet had been lost in the past 30 days. 3 more had been damaged. The waters between Rabaul and Guadalcanal, 600 miles of ocean the Americans called the Slot, had become a graveyard for the finest surface ships the Imperial Japanese Navy possessed. And still the troops on Guadalcanal starved. Still the ammunition ran short. Still the airfield at Henderson remained in American hands. Yamamoto signed the directive that morning. It was not a single order to end the Tokyo Express. It was a directive to begin planning a transition over the coming weeks, from destroyer supply runs to landing barges. The barges would be slower. The barges would be weaker. But the barges could be replaced. Destroyers, at the rate they were being lost, could not. 3 men waited to receive that directive. 3 men whose careers and whose lives were about to be redirected by a piece of paper, signed in a private cabin on a battleship that would never fire her main guns in the Solomons. Rabaul sat on the northern tip of New Britain, a natural volcanic harbor the Australians had built into a colonial port before the Japanese seized it in January of 1942. By the following November, the town had become the beating heart of the Southeast Area Fleet. Every barge, every destroyer, every supply run to the Solomons and New Guinea passed through the offices in Simpson Harbor. And at the top of that command sat Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa. He was 54 years old, a former battleship gunner. In August, at Savo Island, he had led 7 cruisers into an American picket line and sunk 4 Allied heavy cruisers in less than an hour without losing a single ship. It remained one of the most complete surface victories in modern naval history. Newspapers in Tokyo had called him the hero of the South Pacific. Now he read Yamamoto's directive and understood what it meant. He was being asked to feed 17,000 men on Guadalcanal, with vessels that could not outrun a bicycle. He was being asked to sustain a garrison in shallow draft steel boxes that carried 60 soldiers each, or 8 tons of supplies each, that moved at 8 knots on a good sea. The barges would run at night. They would hug the coasts of the intervening islands, hiding by day beneath jungle canopy, moving only in darkness. It was a solution born of exhaustion. Mikawa did not question it. He drafted the operational orders and sent them south, 200 miles further down. The slot, at anchor in the Shortland Islands, Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka read his copy of the same directive aboard the light cruiser Jinsu. He was 50 years old, a graduate of the 41st class of the Imperial Naval Academy and the finest destroyer squadron commander in the Imperial Navy. His subordinates called him tenacious. The Americans, who had come to know his tactics through months of bloody surprise, had come to call him Tanaka the Terror. He had come home 11 days earlier from a battle the Americans would call Tassafaronga. In the pitch dark of 30 November, leading 8 destroyers against a superior American cruiser force, he had launched a coordinated volley of long lance torpedoes that had ripped the American formation apart. One heavy cruiser, the USS Northampton, had gone to the bottom. 3 others, the Minneapolis, the New Orleans, and the Pensacola, had been crippled beyond immediate use. Tanaka had lost a single destroyer. It was the last clear surface victory the Imperial Navy would win in the Solomons campaign, and he did not yet know it. He read Yamamoto's directive and understood only that his squadron was being asked to make one more run. A final destroyer transit to deliver a garrison of engineers and their rice before the barge system took over. The mission was scheduled for the second week of December. His new flagship would be the destroyer Teruzuki, an Akizuki-class vessel commissioned only 3 months earlier, armed with the newest dual-purpose guns in the fleet. Her name meant Shining Moon. 300 miles south of Shortland, across the narrow strait the Americans had come to call Iron Bottom Sound, a small island named Tulagi sat in the shadow of the greater island of Florida. On the seaward side of the harbor at Chesapeake, 4 wooden boats lay moored to a floating dock. They were narrow and long and painted the color of oil-stained slate. Each was 80 feet from bow to stern, 20 feet across the beam, and displaced 50 tons fully loaded. Each was powered by 3 Packard V-12 engines that could push her to 41 knots on smooth water. Each carried 4 torpedo tubes, twin 50 caliber machine gun turrets, and a crew of 2 officers and 11 enlisted men. They were PT-38, PT-46, PT-48, and PT-60. They had arrived at Tulagi on the 12th of October, the first patrol torpedo boats ever to reach the South Pacific fighting. Their squadron, Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3, was commanded by Lieutenant Commander Alan R. Montgomery, a career naval officer who had come up through submarines and understood, better than most, what it meant to fight from a small wooden hull against warships of steel. His crews averaged 19 or 20 years of age. They had come from Nebraska farms and Brooklyn tenements and Alabama sawmills. They had trained on Narragansett Bay in the summer of 1942 and shipped west without knowing what a Daihatsu barge was, or how deep a Mark 8 torpedo ran, or how the Solomon's sun rendered a wool uniform unwebbable within a week. By November they had learned. They stripped their shirts on patrol. They cut their trousers off at the knee. They punched holes in the toes of their leather shoes to let the tropical rot escape. They looked less like sailors than like the survivors of a shipwreck that had never quite ended. They had gone out each night since arrival. They had chased the Tokyo Express. They had launched torpedoes at destroyers, moving at 30 knots on courses they could not predict. They had watched their weapons vanish into wakes and disappear into distance, and on more than one occasion watched their own boats catch fire under return fire from Japanese 5-inch guns. 6 PT boats from the earlier arrivals had already been lost. 17 sailors were dead. And still the Japanese came, night after night, feeding a garrison that would not surrender. Across Sealark Channel, 3 miles from the Chesapeake dock, another kind of graveyard grew each day. Henderson Field lay in the coastal flatland behind Lunga Point on the northern shore of Guadalcanal. It had been carved from a coconut plantation by Japanese engineers in July. American Marines had taken it in August and had held it, barely, through the bloodiest months of the campaign. By November, the airstrip was in continuous operation, but the perimeter of the field looked less like an operational aerodrome than like a scrapyard for aircraft. Wildcats with folded wings and burned cowlings sat in loose rows beside the taxiway. Dauntless dive bombers with their bellies broken open leaned against palms, and along the northern apron, in a line that grew every week, sat the wrecked airframes of Bell P-39 Airacobras and their export cousins, the P-400. The Airacobra was a strange machine. Its engine sat behind the pilot rather than in front of him, driving the propeller through a long shaft that ran under the cockpit floor. This unusual layout had been chosen for a single reason: to make room in the nose of the fighter for a weapon. The weapon was the Oldsmobile M4 automatic cannon. It fired a 37mm shell through the hollow hub of the propeller. Its magazine held 30 rounds in a horseshoe curve. Its rate of fire, when it worked, was 125 rounds per minute. American pilots on Guadalcanal had come to distrust the cannon because it jammed after 2 or 3 shots in the thin air of high-altitude combat. They called the Airacobra a coffin with wings. They preferred almost any other machine. But on the wrecked airframes at Henderson Field, in the moist heat of the coastal flatland, the cannons remained bolted into their mounts. Nobody had removed them. The mechanics who cannibalized the fighters for spare parts took the radios, the instruments, the control cables. They left the guns alone. There was no doctrine for what to do with an aircraft cannon after the aircraft had died. There was no requisition form, no procurement code, no line item in the naval supply chain that covered the salvage of a 37mm automatic weapon from a crashed Army Air Corps fighter for use on a Navy patrol boat. The guns sat in the sun. They sat in the rain. They waited. None of it was connected yet. Yamamoto's directive sat in the operations files at Truk. Mikawa's barge convoys were being assembled at Rabaul and Shortland. Tanaka's Teruzuki was preparing for a run down the slot that neither he nor the 1,500 men aboard her escorting destroyers yet understood would be his last. Montgomery's crews at Chesapeake were cleaning their 50-caliber machine guns and cursing the torpedoes that would not sink what they aimed at. And the wrecked Airacobras at Henderson Field were rusting quietly in the rain, 37mm cannons still bolted into their noses, waiting for someone to see them differently. The 11 days between Yamamoto's directive and the sinking of the Teruzuki passed the way most days pass in a war of attrition. Quietly, with men doing the same things they had done the day before, not knowing which of those actions would prove to be the last. At Shortland Harbor, in the anchorage tucked behind Faro Island at the northern end of the Solomon's chain, the destroyer Teruzuki took on fuel. Her captain was Commander Tsuneo Orita, a torpedo specialist who had served under Tanaka in the Java campaign. Her hull was clean, and her paint was fresh, and her Type 98 dual-purpose guns had not yet fired a shot in anger. On the 10th of December, Tanaka received his final orders. 8 destroyers were to make the run. 250 drums of provisions, lashed together in floating chains, would be dropped in the water off Guadalcanal for the garrison to recover. It was a new tactic. The Japanese called it the drum method. Rather than land troops or offload cargo on the beach, the destroyers would dump the drums overboard while running at speed, and Japanese swimmers on shore would tow them in during the daylight hours that followed. It was inefficient. It was humiliating. It was the closest thing the finest destroyer squadron in the world could still offer to the men who were slowly dying on Guadalcanal. Tanaka boarded the Teruzuki on the 11th of December. He met with Orita on the bridge. He gave his standard instructions. He wished his officers a successful run. He watched the anchor come up out of the black water of Shortland Bay, and the destroyer nosed out into the open sea and turned south. 300 miles ahead, in the dark waters between Savo Island and Cape Esperance, Lieutenant Lester H. Gamble was preparing PT-37 for patrol. He had commanded the boat since her arrival at Tulagi. In the 2 months since, he had launched torpedoes at various targets and hit nothing. This was not, he understood, entirely his fault. The torpedoes were the torpedoes. The targets moved fast. The night was dark, and the doctrine that had been drilled into him at Melville had assumed that his enemy would fight the war he had been trained for, and the enemy had not been so kind. Gamble was joined that night by PT-40, commanded by Lieutenant Charles M. Melhorn, and PT-48, commanded by Lieutenant Robert L. Searles. The three boats slipped their moorings at Saesopie at 10 in the evening and turned north into Iron Bottom Sound. They ran at low idle to reduce their wake. They ran without lights. They ran with lookouts posted at the bow, at the stern, on the twin 50 caliber turrets. The Solomon night was overcast. There was no moon. The visibility, at best, was 300 yards. At worst, it was the length of a man's arm. They took station off the northwestern shoulder of Guadalcanal, in the lee of Savo, and waited. The Teruzuki arrived at Cape Esperance a few minutes after 2 in the morning of the 12th of December. She was leading the column. The drums had already been dropped farther east along the coast, and she and her 7 escorts were turning to run for home. Tanaka was on the bridge. Orita was beside him. The lookouts on the port side saw nothing but water and darkness. The 3 PT boats saw the destroyers. There was no communication between them. Radios in the Solomons that year were unreliable and often gave away position more than they aided coordination. Each boat commander made his own decision. Each turned in on his own line. Each opened his throttles and drove for the enemy formation at 40 knots. The Teruzuki's lookouts saw the wakes at 800 yards. Orita shouted an order. The forward turrets began to swing. And in that same instant, 12 torpedoes left 12 tubes on 3 American boats, and 12 wakes drew 12 parallel lines through the black water of Iron Bottom Sound. 10 missed. 2 hit. The first struck the Teruzuki near the stern, on the port side, roughly 20 feet forward of the rudder. It ripped a hole in the plating below the waterline that a truck could have driven through. The blast lifted the fantail out of the sea. The engine room bulkhead buckled inward. The main shaft twisted. Water poured in at a rate the pumps could not answer. And on the bridge, 60 feet forward, the deck plates leapt upward with such violence that Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka, standing at his chart table, was thrown against the overhead and knocked unconscious. He did not see the second torpedo hit. It struck near the first, deepening the wound in the stern and opening the compartments to the sea. The Teruzuki began to settle by the stern in the first minutes after impact, and the settling did not stop. On the bridge, Commander Orita found himself lying against the bulkhead of the wheelhouse with his face bleeding and his ship dying beneath his feet. He crawled to Tanaka. The admiral was breathing. He was not conscious. Orita ordered him carried to the boat deck. The Teruzuki fought her flooding for 3 hours. Her captain gave the order to open her Kingston valves at 4:40 in the morning to hasten the sinking and prevent capture. The destroyer Naganami came alongside and took off the wounded. The destroyer Arashi picked up men from the water. 196 survivors were saved. 156 were forced to swim for the shore at Kamimbo, 4 miles distant, in the darkness and the oil and the black water. Some of them made it, some did not. Tanaka survived. He was carried aboard the Naganami with his head bandaged and his uniform stiff with blood. He was evacuated to Singapore to recover from his injuries. He would be relieved of his command in the Solomons and reassigned to shore postings for the remainder of the war. The finest destroyer squadron commander in the Imperial Japanese Navy had been removed from the war in the Pacific, and the men who had removed him were 3 American lieutenants in wooden boats, whose average crew age was 19. Gamble, Melhorn, and Searles ran their boats back to Tulagi at dawn. They did not know they had sunk a destroyer. They did not know they had wounded an admiral. They knew only that they had heard an enormous explosion behind them and had not been shot at afterward, which was more than they usually had to report. It would be days before the sinking of the Teruzuki was confirmed, and weeks before the identity of the admiral aboard her became known to American intelligence. At Rabaul, the news reached Vice Admiral Mikawa within 12 hours. He absorbed it in silence. He had known Tanaka for 25 years. They had entered the Naval Academy in the same generation. They had risen through the same commands. The loss of the Teruzuki was a minor blow to the Imperial fleet. The loss of Tanaka's ability to command at sea was not minor. It was, Mikawa understood, the end of something. The Tokyo Express, as it had been fought for the past 4 months, was finished. The barge system that Yamamoto had directed him to build would now be the only supply line to the Solomons. He signed the requisitions that morning. Landing barges, fuel drums, armored escort boats of the Sukutei class. He estimated he would need 40 large Daihatsu barges per convoy to move a battalion of infantry 300 miles. He estimated he would need 15 small Shohatsu barges to accompany them. He estimated he would lose 10% per run. He was wrong about that last figure. He would lose far more. 3 weeks later, at the end of January 1943, a staff officer from the combined fleet arrived at Rabaul with new orders from Yamamoto. Guadalcanal was to be abandoned. The garrison was to be evacuated. The operation would be called Ke. The evacuation was carried out between the 1st and 7th of February 1943 at night by destroyers making high-speed runs. The Japanese did not tell the Americans. The Americans did not realize what was happening until the last night, when the destroyers came in one final time and took off the last of the perimeter. 10,652 Japanese soldiers were lifted from the beaches of Cape Esperance. It was the most successful evacuation of the Pacific War. It was also the end of any Japanese hope of returning to Guadalcanal. 2 months later, on the 18th of April 1943, on an inspection flight to the airfield at Buin on Bougainville, Yamamoto's transport aircraft was intercepted by 16 American P-38 Lightnings that had flown 435 miles from Guadalcanal on the strength of a decoded radio message. His aircraft was shot down over the jungle. His body was recovered the following day. The man who had signed the directive that put the barges in the water did not live to see the harvest of that decision. The same month, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa was recalled to Tokyo for consultations and reassigned. His replacement as commander of the 8th Fleet was Vice Admiral Tomoshige Samejima. Samejima inherited a fleet that had lost its finest destroyer commander, its finest strategic mind, and its remaining faith in its own supply plan, all within 4 months. And still no American PT boat, in the early spring of 1943, carried a weapon capable of sinking a Daihatsu barge with anything like efficiency. That began to change in the machine shop at Sisapi, in circumstances that the official records have never fully documented. The story of who first made the connection has been lost to the imprecision of wartime records. Motor torpedo boat. Squadron 3 kept a log, but the log did not name the mechanics who did the salvage work, or the machinists who fabricated the mount, or the ordnance men from the Cactus Air Force who taught the sailors how to load the horseshoe magazines. What the log records is simply that in the early months of 1943, a decision was made at Tulagi to remove a 37mm automatic cannon from a crashed P-39 at Henderson Field and to install it on the bow of a PT boat. The men who did the work were enlisted. They were young. They were tired. They had no authorization. They had no engineering data. They had no factory drawings. They had a wrecked airframe with a bolted-in gun and a wooden boat with a flat plywood foredeck, and the shared certainty, born of 2 months of futile combat, that something had to change. They cut the cannon free with hacksaws and cutting torches. They removed the hydraulic recoil cylinder, the ammunition feed chute, the firing solenoid, the horseshoe magazine rack. They carried the parts by truck down from Henderson to Lunga Point and by small boat across Sealark Channel to Chesapeake. They welded a pedestal mount from scrap steel salvaged from wrecked Airacobra landing gear. They drilled through the plywood foredeck of a PT boat and bolted the mount to the oak framing underneath. They did all of this without asking permission and without expecting approval, because they understood in the practical way that fighting men understand these things, that if it did not work, no one would need to know they had tried, and if it did work, no one would care that they had not asked. The first cannon was mounted on a PT boat at Tulagi in the early weeks of 1943. The exact date has not survived. The identity of the boat has not survived. What survived was the result. On the first patrol, in the darkness off the northwestern coast of Guadalcanal, the modified boat encountered a Daihatsu barge inbound, with troops for the garrison at Munda Point on New Georgia. The gunner opened fire at close range. The result was decisive. The barge burned. The barge sank. The men aboard her did not come out of the water. The Japanese did not immediately understand what had happened. Radio intercepts recorded confusion in the days that followed. Reports from surviving barge crews described a strange new American weapon. A cannon, small caliber, high rate of fire, explosive rounds that penetrated armor at close range. One coded transmission from a signal station on Kolombangara, relaying reports from the western approaches to New Georgia, used a Japanese phrase that translated roughly as demon boats with aircraft guns. At Rabaul, the intercept crossed the desk of Vice Admiral Samegima. He read it. He set it down. He picked up his pen and began to write orders, adjusting the routing of the next barge convoy to Munda. He did not yet understand that the orders would not be enough. He did not yet understand that the men who had built the weapon were not building it in Washington, or in Pearl Harbor, or in any place from which the flow of new equipment could be predicted or countered. They were building it 3 miles from Henderson Field in the machine shop at Chesapeake, from parts that had been sitting in the open weather for months, and that neither navy in the Pacific had ever thought to use. By the middle of 1943, 3 more PT boats at Tulagi carried M4 cannons on their bows. By the end of that year, more than a dozen. By the middle of 1944, every PT boat in the South Pacific and every new PT boat coming off the production lines at Bayonne and New Orleans mounted a 37mm automatic gun as standard armament. By the summer of 1943, the barge system that Yamamoto had ordered into planning was dying by inches along the length of the Solomon chain. At Rabaul, Vice Admiral Tomoshige Samegima inherited a problem no naval officer of his generation had been trained to solve. His fleet had no way to protect the barges. His destroyers, what remained of them, were needed for combat operations against American surface forces moving up the chain. His cruisers had been withdrawn to Truk after the November raids on Rabaul. His transport aircraft were being shot out of the sky by American fighters based on airstrips that had not existed 6 months earlier. The barges ran alone. They ran at night. They ran hugging the coasts, and still they burned. On the map in Samegima's operations room at Simpson's Harbor, small red marks began to appear each morning along the routes his convoys had followed the night before. Colombanga, Vella La Vella, New Georgia, Choiseul, Bougainville. Each red mark was a barge lost. Each barge lost was 60 men who would not arrive, or 8 tons of rice that would not be eaten, or a battalion's worth of ammunition that would not reach a garrison already down to its last magazines. The marks accumulated faster than the shipyards at Yokohama could build replacements. By August of 1943, Samejima was losing barges at a rate his staff calculated as 60 per month. By October, 70. By the end of the year, the tempo had passed the point at which arithmetic could keep pace with attrition. He wrote to Tokyo. He requested destroyer escorts for the barge convoys. He requested air cover for the coastal routes. He requested anything, in truth, that might halt the bleeding. Tokyo replied with orders to maintain the supply operations at existing levels using existing resources. Tokyo did not have destroyers to spare. Tokyo did not have aircraft to spare. Tokyo did not by this point have anything to spare. And so the barges continued to run, and the PT boats continued to burn them, and the men on the receiving end of the failed supply chain continued to grow thinner. Above Samejima, in the layered structure of Japanese command in the southeast area, sat Vice Admiral Jinichi Kusaka, commander of the Southeast Area Fleet. Kusaka had been at Rabaul since the spring of 1942. He had watched the Guadalcanal campaign begin, had watched it collapse, had watched the Tokyo Express run and fail. Now he watched Rabaul itself begin to be cut off from the rest of the Japanese Empire. American carrier raids in November of 1943 had driven the Japanese surface fleet out of Simpson Harbor permanently. American airstrips built at Torokina on Bougainville and at Cape Torokina and at Munda now bracketed Rabaul from 3 directions. By the spring of 1944, the base that had once been the beating heart of the southeast area was strategically bypassed. It would remain in Japanese hands until the end of the war, but it would not, from that point forward, matter to the war. 200 miles south of Rabaul, on the volcanic island of Bougainville, the largest concentration of Japanese ground troops in the Solomons watched the ration cards get shorter month by month. The commander responsible for those men was General Hitoshi Imamura, headquartered at Rabaul as commander of the 8th Area Army. He was 57 years old, a career infantry officer, a veteran of the China War. He had been considered, before Guadalcanal, one of the most capable field commanders in the Imperial Army. Now he sat at a desk, in a bunker cut into the volcanic tuff of the Rabaul Hills, and he read the supply reports each morning, and he understood that he was being asked to hold 100,000 men in position on islands that could no longer be fed. The math had gotten simple by 1944. In April of that year, the standard rice ration for a Japanese soldier on Bougainville was cut from 750 grams per day to 250. In September, the rice ration was eliminated entirely. What the men received after that was what they could grow themselves in the volcanic soil of the interior, and what they could catch in the coastal streams, and what they could dig from the jungle floor with their bayonets. Imamura issued orders. His staff drew up rotational schedules. Whole battalions were pulled off defensive lines and put to work in garden plots, planting sweet potato and cassava and the coarse tropical vegetables that would grow in the poor soil. American pilots based at Torokina learned to identify the garden plots from the air. They dropped napalm on them. They came back the next day and dropped more. It became, for the fighter squadrons of the 13th Air Force, a routine mission. The Japanese called the men who tended the plots the vegetable soldiers. Many of them did not survive the war. The numbers, when they were compiled later by Australian intelligence officers who studied the captured Japanese records, told a story that no combat action report could contain. On Bougainville alone, during the roughly 21 months of active operations that followed the American landings at Torokina, in November of 1943, 8,200 Japanese soldiers were killed in combat. 16,600 died of disease and malnutrition. On the neighboring islands of New Britain and New Ireland, the tolls were similar. At Rabaul itself, the garrison of 100,000 men that had once been the strategic hub of the entire southeast area held out until the Emperor's surrender in August of 1945, sustained on a diet that had been reduced, by the end, to a species of jungle root that the men called sotetsu, and that had, in normal times, been considered inedible. The PT boats did not do all of this. The submarines of the 7th Fleet and the aircraft of the 5th and 13th Air Forces did the greater share of the interdiction. But the PT boats did the coastal work. The PT boats sat off the beaches at night and caught the barges that had crept past the submarines and the aircraft. The PT boats, more than any other class of vessel in the American Navy, were the reason the last mile of the supply chain never closed. And the weapon that made the PT boats effective at that work was the 37mm cannon that had come, in the first instance, off the wrecked nose of a Bell P-39 Airacobra at Henderson Field. By the end of 1943, the Bureau of Ordnance had signed a contract with the Colt Patent Firearms Company. The new naval version of the cannon, designated the M9, went into production at the Colt plant in Hartford, Connecticut. In the spring of 1944, it fired the same 37mm shell as the salvaged aircraft weapon, but from a longer barrel at higher muzzle velocity. It was heavier. It was better made. It was designed, from the first drawing, to be fired from the pitching wooden deck of a small combat vessel, rather than from the nose of a diving fighter. By the last months of the war, the Elko Boatyard at Bayonne, New Jersey, and the Higgins Yard at New Orleans were mounting M9 cannons on new PT boats as standard bow armament, exactly as the earlier boats had mounted them by field improvisation. The men who had done that field improvisation back at Sesame in the early weeks of 1943 were mostly gone from the Solomons by the time the M9 came off the Colt production line. Some had been rotated home, some had been transferred to other theaters. Some, like a number of the sailors from Motor Torpedo Boats Squadron 3, had died in later actions along the New Georgia and Bougainville coasts. Their names are recorded, for the most part, in the muster rolls of their squadrons and in the citations that accompanied their medals, and in Robert J. Bulkeley's official history of the PT boat service, which was written in the years after the war on commission from the Navy and published in 1962, with a foreword by President John F. Kennedy, who had commanded PT 109 in the same waters. The book runs to 592 pages. It records, in the dry official prose that naval historians use, the sinking of the Teruzuki off Cape Esperance in December of 1942. It records the improvisation of the 37mm mount at Tulagi in the early months of 1943. It records the transition from the salvaged M4 to the purpose-built M9 later in the war. It records the barges, hundreds of them, that PT boats destroyed in the Solomons, in New Guinea, in the Philippines, in the Mediterranean, and along the coast of French Indochina in the final months before the surrender. It does not record the names of the men at Henderson Field who first walked across the coral apron and looked at the wrecked P-39s differently. Those names, as best as can now be determined, were not written down. On the 6th of September, 1945, aboard the British aircraft carrier HMS Glory, anchored off Rabaul, General Hitoshi Imamura signed the instrument of surrender for all Japanese forces in New Guinea, New Britain, New Ireland, Bougainville, and the adjacent islands. He was 59 years old. He wore his dress uniform and his sword at his side. The Australian war artist Sally Herman was on the deck of the carrier and made sketches that would later become oil paintings. Herman wrote afterward that Imamura's posture at the surrender ceremony had remained straight and formal, and that his expression had been, in Herman's phrase, that of a man who had made his peace with something a long time before he arrived at the table. Behind Imamura, on the beaches of New Britain and the interior valleys of Bougainville and the wharves of Kavieng, 100,000 Japanese soldiers waited to be repatriated. Their uniforms hung on their frames. Their skin had the color of tallow. Many of them would spend another year in Australian internment camps before being sent home. And some would die in those camps of the malnutrition and the diseases they had contracted during the years when the barges had not arrived. The number of Japanese ground troops who died in the southeast area during the years of the barge campaign from all causes has been variously estimated by post-war historians at between 80,000 and 120,000 men. The majority did not die in combat. The majority died because the food and the medicines and the ammunition and the reinforcements that had been assembled at Rabaul and loaded onto Daihatsu barges and dispatched down. The slot at night did not arrive. Some were sunk by submarines, some were destroyed by aircraft, and a large number were burned to the waterline by patrol torpedo boats, mounting cannons that had originated in the noses of a fighter aircraft that the Royal Air Force had rejected and that American pilots had mocked. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was killed by American P-38 Lightnings on the 18th of April, 1943, 17 days before he could have observed the first substantial effects of the directive he had signed at Truk 5 months earlier. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa was recalled to Tokyo in April of 1943 and finished the war in shore assignments in the home islands. Vice Admiral Tomoshige Samajima remained at Rabaul until relieved in December of 1943 and finished the war on the Naval General Staff. Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka remained at Rabaul through the isolation and was one of the senior naval officers present at the surrender ceremony. Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka served out the war in staff assignments in Southeast Asia. He returned to Japan in 1946 and died in retirement in July of 1969. General Hitoshi Imamura was tried by an Australian military tribunal at Rabaul in 1946 on charges related to the treatment of prisoners of war under his command. He was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. He was released in 1954. He wrote a memoir in his final years that included his reflections on the Southeast Area campaign. In that memoir, he did not blame the barges, or the American aircraft, or the submarines, or the PT boats. He blamed, in the phrase he used, the arithmetic of a war his country had never been prepared to fight. He died in 1968 at the Battleship Cove Naval Museum in Fall River, Massachusetts. The Elco 80-foot PT boat, PT 617, is preserved as she was configured in 1945. She sits in a covered berth on the Taunton River. Visitors can walk her deck. On the bow, forward of the chart house, is a 37mm M9 cannon, mounted on a factory-built pedestal that traces its lineage directly back to the improvised welded mount that some now-forgotten chief machinist's mate fabricated at the Chesapeake shop in early 1943. The gun is not operational. It has not fired a round since the war, but it is still there, bolted to the deck, pointing forward, silent. The sailors who first mounted its ancestor on a wooden hull in the shadow of Iron Bottom Sound did not know what they had begun. They had a problem to solve. They solved it with what was in front of them. They took a weapon that a British Air Ministry had rejected, and that American pilots had ridiculed, and that Japanese aviators had swatted from the sky, and they bolted it to a boat that was not designed to carry it, and they used it to kill a supply line that stretched from Rabaul to Bougainville to New Guinea, and, in the end, all the way back to the docks at Yokohama. 6 flag officers stood in the chain of command that had ordered, protected, and depended on that supply line. Yamamoto signed the directive. Mikawa built the fleet of barges. Tanaka lost his flagship and his sea career on the night the story truly began. Samejima watched the barges vanish night after night. Kusaka saw Rabaul cut off from the world. Imamura cut his soldiers' rations to nothing and then watched them starve. 100,000 men, 600 miles of ocean, and a 37mm cannon that came off a fighter no one wanted, bolted to a wooden boat by sailors whose names no one wrote down. The rain still falls on Guadalcanal. It falls on the quiet coral of Cape Esperance. It falls on the wreck of the Teruzuki, resting 800 meters down in the black of Iron Bottom Sound, her stern torn open by 2 American torpedoes, her guns pointing at nothing. It falls on the memorial at Torokina, on the empty airstrips at Munda, on the tunnels beneath Rabaul, where 100,000 men once waited for barges that would not come. It falls in the American summer on the covered berth at Fall River, where the last of the Elco boats sits at her moorings with her cannon still bolted to her bow. None of them speak. They do not need to. The story is written in the ration cards, in the salvage logs, in the depth soundings of the Solomon Sea, and in the muster rolls of Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3, where the names of the men who commanded PT-37 and PT-40 and PT-48 on the night of the 12th of December 1942 are still recorded, and where the names of the mechanics who cut the first cannon from a crashed Airacobra are still not